Hello, namaste, and welcome to all the distinguished panelists and the participants in this special program titled A New Social Contract for Building More Inclusive State, Leaving No One Behind. This is a special program organized on the occasion of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples and on the occasion of the 6th anniversary of Indigenous Television. And for those who are not aware of this International Day of the World Indigenous Peoples, August 9, every year, almost 500 million indigenous peoples living in 90 different countries across the globe actually mark as the World Indigenous Peoples Day, commemorating the first formal meeting of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Peoples, which was held back in 1982. The working group was formed by the UN to address the problems faced by the world indigenous peoples. In the leadership of this very same working group, the UN later on adopted the declarations on the rights of indigenous peoples in the year 2007, and in short, which is known as UNDRIP, which is the foundation of all sort of rights of indigenous peoples today. And in the recommendations of the same UN Working Group on the indigenous populations, moreover, the finding the needs for indigenous specific mechanism within UN systems, the UN formed the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues as a subsidiary body, or the advisory body within ECOSOC, advisory body of the ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council, and also the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, MRIP in short, which is advisory body or subsidiary body of the Human Rights Council, along with the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples and UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. So these are some of the indigenous specific UN mechanisms which exist within the UN systems. So in this special program, I have invited distinguished panelists from two main indigenous specific mechanisms. The Vice Chair of UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Fulman Chaudhary, and Binota Moidumai, Vice Chair of Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And equally, I have invited Gam Shimray, current Secretary General of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact and umbrella organizations of Asia's Indigenous Peoples organizations. So every year the UN marks this special day with different theme, and this year's theme is leaving no one behind, indigenous peoples and the call for social contract. So like in other parts, indigenous peoples in Asia have long been demanding inclusion, participations with social and economic benefits. So to start with our discussions, I would like to call upon Fulman Chaudhary, Vice Chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And I would like to request him to elaborate on what does this year's theme, especially leaving no one behind, indigenous peoples and the call for new social contract, what it means and why a new social contract is important for indigenous peoples in Asia or for the indigenous peoples worldwide. So as this theme actually proposed by the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, so I would like to call upon the Fulman Chaudhary. The floor is yours, Fulman.
Thank you, Daddy. At first, I would like to congratulate to your entire indigenous celebrating 6th anniversary of the establishing the television. Of course, you have wonderful and remarkable work during these 6 years, raising genuine issues of indigenous people and advocating the rights of indigenous people, your television. Once again, Devji, big congratulations for your fantastic work and also best wishes all of you on the very special day of International Day of the all indigenous peoples that we are celebrating every year. As we are talking importance of the theme of International Day, all indigenous peoples, leaving no one behind, indigenous people, and the call for a new social contract. Definitely, this theme is really important for the indigenous people. Yes, social contract is itself political philosophy, and it drives to the state and the peoples. The social contract actually all old, but it is using now with wider understanding. If we look scenario of the old population, 70% of the old population are commonly facing serious problem like land grabbing, inequality, wealth inequality, poverty, social economic disadvantage, high level of inequality with justice, access of mainstream development mechanism, institutional instability, financial crisis, recognition of indigenous people, and many more. These all things played a negative impact among the community and the effect to social harmony, creating social tension and conflicts. While talking about the IP's right, we have several challenges what we are facing across the Asia, mainly ancestral land, forest, natural resources, which causing criminalization, displacement, threats, arrests, fake charges, detention, killing, and many more are serious human rights violations. All these disparities of domination, suppression of discrimination taking place over indigenous people are putting the indigenous people's identity and human rights into risk. The international human rights instrument have ensured our indigenous people's rights, which are ratified and signed by many of the states, but they still deny accepting our identity and existence of indigenous people. In the name of development, indigenous people are displacing gradually from their native land. That's why all these issues should be addressed by the state. Therefore, all these things is in related with the social contract and SDG 2030 agenda. The whole society have to come together to fight against this inequality. That's why social contract is needed in this regard. This is the time for us to play a vast role to end all kinds of discrimination and focusing all these things and realizing social contract should be applied. The situation might be changed. Hence, this year we are celebrating International Day of the Indigenous Peoples with the specific theme, leaving no one behind, indigenous people, and the call for new social contract. Over to you, Devji.
Thank you, Fulman Chaudhary, for this elaborations of this year's theme and the struggles of indigenous peoples in Asia. And now I would like to call upon the Shimray, who is Secretary General of AIPP, and he himself is the Human Rights and Peace Building Advocates. And I would like to request him also to give the perspective or indigenous people's perspective from Asia, especially on this year's theme. As you listened the elaboration from Fulman Chaudhary about this year's theme, leaving no one behind, and indigenous peoples and the call for a new social contract. And I would like to request you to give your perspective or AIPP's perspective, let's say, what it basically means and why this new social contract is important for indigenous peoples, especially indigenous peoples in Asia. And also I would like to request you to elaborate also on what would new social contract between the indigenous peoples and a state look like. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave, and also thank you, Fulman, for elaborating the theme as to why this has been the call for this year's on the Indigenous Peoples Day. Well, I think a lot of points there and questions that needs to be elaborated, put forward by Dave. The first thing is, of course, why this is important is because social contract, as we understand it, philosophically speaking, it is also everything that it is the source of everything that is good upon which our life depends. And this is where it is supposed to be embedded in the Constitution as well as protected. But coming back to this UN DRIP, I think what is very important is to realize that there is a loss of meaning. And this theme also implies that there is a meaning crisis. And therefore, we need to uncover and recover this meaning, even in the context of the UN RIP. Say, for example, very briefly saying, why did Indigenous peoples Indigenous peoples advocates and fight for this UN RIP? And why was such a declaration needed in? One is because we were advocating that there are other peoples who are not recognized by Indigenous peoples beyond those peoples who are already recognized, and that needs to be accounted for, and they need to be included. And without these, there will not be peace. There will be more violence and bloodshed across the world. This is a key message that we have been sending all the time. And therefore, the UN DRIP, what it is looking at the minimum, the process indicates that there has to be reform across different countries and even at the international level. That is the purpose and the meaning of the UN DRIP. And now the thing is, when I say recovering this meaning, is to bring back this understanding so that we have a full understanding of this UN DRIP. And I think appropriately so when we say we are looking for a new social contract, it also means we are looking for a new meaning in our life at the global scale, if I may say so. So one thing is very clear, the UN DRIP, the reform process that it demands at the minimum, international level, it is happening, but nothing has really happened on the ground as far as Asia is concerned. Which means that as peoples, we are not yet part of the state architecture. That must be made very clear. And therefore, reforms and agreements and accords are to be made so that our right to self-determination is recognized as peoples, not even as right holders, but as peoples, to put it in the appropriate context. That is what is being lost. And the governments are not committed to that. And therefore, we are still not part of the architecture of the state, which it means effectively, it also means that we are not even part of the civic space that is within the state system because we are not included, right? It goes to that extent. And that is why in many countries in Asia, for example, there are people without even citizenship. And therefore, there are people who are sort of in a legal black hole. They have no ground to stand. They have nowhere to move to other country, or here they have no legal status. So they are non-existent, or they are in a sort of a legal black hole. Every day their lives are endangered. So therefore, how can we talk about a social contract in which we are included? We are still not part of the state architecture. And I think that is very important, and that's what we should be looking at. So this non-inclusion definitely is one, and therefore the need for looking for an alternative civic space that includes Indigenous peoples is more inclusive and more democratic. So we are also talking about transforming the state towards a more grassroots-oriented democracy that is governed by the communities from the ground, and it's not kind of a top-down. That's the kind of social contract we're looking at. The other aspect of social contract is that, philosophically speaking, the idea of social contract is confined to the present community of the people who are part of the citizens of the state. But Indigenous peoples were very clear that our consciousness of life and time includes the past, present, and the future. That is where we have many sayings and the wisdom that goes that we draw our strength from our children, meaning the future, right? And then the past, that is where we're talking about our ancestors. We have obligations to the past as well. We have obligations to the future. We have also obligations to the natural environment, the Mother Earth, as we say. These are all not part of the social contract conception in the philosophical sense that we see today. So if we are looking at this new meaning, then we have to also take the opportunity in terms of what kind of new meaning are we seeking? that the social contract, idea of social contract becomes more comprehensive and encompassing. And this is very relevant because we are not individual centric as indigenous peoples. We are also relational to the surroundings that we have. The Ainu people are very clear about this. They call it Yureshi Pamashor. The Samai in Malaysia call it Tenhak, for example. All these relational aspects to which we have obligations. This kind of understanding must be part of that new meaning making, as well as peacemaking and reconciliation as a larger society, as well as with the surrounding environment that we have for the sake of the healthy planet on which our life depends upon. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you so much, Gam. I will come back to you in the second round, and thank you for your in-depth elaboration of the concept. Now, I would like to invite Binota Moidavai, who is current Vice Chair of MRIP and the former Chair of Board of Trustees of UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples as well. Binota, as you represent the Indigenous peoples from Asia and Pacific at the MRIP, and what I would like to say is there are many instances of indigenous peoples who are driven away from their lands and territories, and they have been marginalized from political and economic activities as well. And indigenous peoples have never been meaningfully included in the social contract as well, and also instances in some Asian countries. And there are also some instances that in Asian countries that indigenous peoples are making their effort to seek to address those sort of discrimination or exclusion through different means like apologies, truth and reconciliation efforts, or legislative or constitutional efforts. So in this context, I would like to request you to share some examples in your knowledge from Asian countries together with the efforts made by the MRIP, Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as regional and other international mechanisms to address the political and economic marginalizations of indigenous peoples. Binota, the floor is yours.
Kulumka, that is a namaste or greetings in my language. You asked me a quite broad question, I think. I'll try to elaborate and try to explain what we are initiated as AMRIP. But thank you very much for organizing this event, and also congratulations for celebrating 6th anniversary of the Indigenous television. I think this is one of the small initiative of building the social contract. Would be one of the area to continue. But anyway, thank you so much, and I'm very happy to be part of here today, along with distinguished Secretary General of AIPP, Cam Shimray, and also the distinguished Permanent Foreign Member, Fulman Chaudhary. As Fulman Chaudhary has already elaborated why the theme it is here, Cam has already deeply explained, which is really so deep meaning. I'm also trying to digest all the languages myself to understand it very clearly. Now, when you talk about the AMRIP perspective, it is then I have to elaborate a little bit from the perspective of what is AMRIP, then the mandate ourselves, where we are. If you see the mandate of AMRIP, it is clearly identified. This is the work on the implementation of the UN DRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Particularly, this is identified that to provide a better understanding the provisions of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also to propose concrete actions that states, indigenous peoples, civil society, international organizations, national human institutions, others can take this in order to further its implementation. And the other mandate is of course, included a country engagement upon request by the state and indigenous peoples. And so this is very briefly the mandate. Now, we as AMRIP, so because of the part of the mandate is we take, it is one is the study and also at the same time prepare a report. So when we do this study and report two different themes, so we also provide advice to the Human Rights Council, what should be the next step according to the findings. So this one, when we discuss about AMRIF as a UN mechanisms, how we can contribute this political economy marginalization of indigenous people, this is then while we provide the advice and recommendations, this then it's the member states, indigenous people organizations, other international organizations, how they really consider this. But we do interpretation, all the issues that related to the indigenous peoples. Now, by saying that, what I'd like to elaborate here in terms of this social contract. One is that AMRIF conducted a study in 2019. One is this recognition, repatriation, and reconciliation. And that we also provided recommendations to the Human Rights Council. And we also noted there are some good examples how actually should work within state and indigenous peoples to advance indigenous peoples' rights on the ground through the development of laws, policies, and programs, and their participation in the decision-making level, and strengthening the traditional governance systems. And one of the important elements we noted there that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, they set out 10 key principles for this reconciliation process, which is really very important. You really can work on that. Perhaps there will be a good opportunity to bridge the gap between the state and indigenous peoples in many countries. And those principles are, one is definitely UN DRIP, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is the framework that provided for all levels and all sectors of society when we approach this reconciliation. And then second one is, of course, the indigenous people's self-determination rights that must be recognized and respected. And also we also mentioned there that this is not only the self-determination, but the issue of applications like existing treaties, agreements, or constructing arrangements, or constitutional rights of indigenous peoples. It should be recognized, observed, honored, and enforced as acts of the reconciliation. The other thing is the relationship here is this not only the public truth sharing issues, also the apology or commemoration, the acknowledgement about the past harm. So this is also the important thing. And also the relationship, constructive action to address the ongoing legacies of colonialism. So this is also one thing that they're distracting all the indigenous people's education, language, cultures, health, all this and that. And also we also address about this equitable and inclusive society to close the gaps in this reconciliation, and also the responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationship. And also we also emphasize this traditional knowledge issue, that because the elders, how we can really understand each other as indigenous people, that our elders are the one actually keepers of the traditional knowledge. So these concepts, practices, it is important in this long-term process. Like for the social contract issue, this is also important for so the study find this process. Now, if we talk about the Asia perspective, of course, if we see the example, so for example, indigenous people's rights in the Philippines, this is some way we can think of that a process, or the recognition of Ainu people in Japan. And also, for example, the treaties agreement, the one Chittagong Hill Trucks Accord in Bangladesh, it's a process of recognitions and reconciliation, and also to some way taking forward the positive development for advancing indigenous peoples' political, social, economic, cultural sides. So these are the examples I can share. Some of course, if we talk about other areas in line with this approach of social contract, what share, Fullman, G, and also GAM, we see some good example in Latin America countries and even in Canada itself as well. So the thing is, now in our Asia context, though there are some challenges and there are some also good examples, but there are still challenges. And for the MDIP is, as I mentioned, based on the mandate, we provide the recommendations. We try to facilitate. Where is problem? Our role is where we receive invitation for the facilitation, we play that role, provide advice and suggestion. For example, now MRIP is giving advice to the Finnish government on the Sami Parliament Act. And of course, not only the Finland, we also give some other countries already. So I have just given an example. So see, this is the approach and this is how we do as an MRIP. So here I like to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Binota, for this comprehensive elaborations on the work of the MRIP as well as your perspective on the social contract in Asia. Now, I would like to call upon Fullman Chaudhary again for the second round. That in your first elaboration or intervention, you just also elaborated that there are many instances of indigenous peoples in Nepal being displaced from their land and territories. And they have been marginalized from the political or economic activities. And they, as I said earlier at the background, that the indigenous peoples were never included meaningfully in the decision-making level as well. So I would like to request you to share your experiences with within the UN Permanent Forum as a vice chair or the member you served at least for last four or 5 years. So how UN Permanent Forum on indigenous issues made efforts to address such the problems faced by indigenous peoples. And also, as you are from Nepal, and I would like to request you to share how indigenous peoples in Nepal are seeking to address such political or social or economic problems.
David, thank you once again for very good question. Of course, I would say if we should consolidate to stand together in advancing our struggle at the local, national, and international level. In this situation, all the indigenous people are further confronted with the challenges in upholding their rules to defense of the indigenous people's land, forests, including territories, natural resources, cultural and values, which are driven away from the state, and they are suffering with the serious violation of human rights. There is much to celebrate, including solid human rights standards on which to build inclusive society in partnership with indigenous people. Of course, the implement of the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People and the ILO Convention 169 can today be found across the globe on many national laws, policies, and institutions. That's why we have many more official recommendations made by Permanent Forum in previous year, and that should be respect from member state. In particular, I would say here, respect the rights of indigenous people. And regarding to the ILO Convention 169, Nepal government has ratified this convention in 2007, but still Nepal government has not complete action plan to respect the ILO Convention 169. And in this context, we Permanent Forum already has make attention to the Nepal government that the Nepal government should be applied and adopt this convention to respect the rights of indigenous people. But we are still looking for Nepal government's proper action. If the Nepal government will take the proper action to respect ILO Convention 169. But we are facilitating between indigenous peoples and member state and other political parties to address this issue. So this is the very big challenging to implement the ILO Convention 169. Just I would say in context of the Nepal and other things in Asia region, if we see, we have many specific recommendations which is made by the Permanent Forum in previous year, specifically like India, Bangladesh, Cambodia. We are addressing, we are advocating, and we are raising the issue that the member state should to address the issue if they are if they are committed to uphold the indigenous people's right, but still the member states are not in favor of indigenous people in Asia region. So this is the situation. But we have to unite, and we have to work together among the indigenous people and member state. I would say, Devji.
Thank you, Fulmanji. In the second round now, I would like to call upon Gyan Shimray, as you have listened the effort made by the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, as well as UN Permanent Forum on indigenous issues as well, that you have listened. And as you lead the umbrella organization of indigenous peoples in Asia, just I would like to know and ask you how to ensure the state are accountable for and address the needs of the indigenous, let's say indigenous peoples or the social groups, specifically indigenous peoples who are often left out. And again, I would like to ask you perhaps this is a repetitive question again, what are the roles of the regional as well as international mechanisms in ensuring the structure and the systems that provide the inclusive outcomes, especially for indigenous peoples?
Okay, thank you. I think the first thing, just stating the fundamental facts in reality, is that we must realize that we are in a meaning crisis, and therefore we must try to uncover and recover those meaning and the purpose of why we're here and why we're discussing this matter. See, the first thing why I'm saying this is also that look at the characteristics of the states in Asia at this point of time. They are becoming overarchingly what they will call the state sovereignty as something that is above the law. So rule of law is not respected. So it is becoming like a self-perpetuating and self-justifying instrument or a government or all this kind of leaders. That is where the major problem lies. So we need, first of all, leaders who are committed to nation building, leaders who are committed to democratizing the state, in which it makes to make it more inclusive. Why I'm saying this is that we see that to be some of the fundamental problems, and that is also where our role comes in terms of working with the governments. At the outset, I just want to say that we are all prepared. We want to work with them. So that we are also objectively, just not rhetorically speaking, we know that there are many weaknesses in the state. They don't have the capacity to respond and address our issues. There are intellectual challenges, resource challenges, and institutional design defects challenges within the Indian states, if you may say so. And in this, of course, it is only a dialogue process, through a participatory process, that we can begin to resolve and address some of these shortcomings, to kind of fill that gap we're talking about. And in this, of course, why should the state shy away from taking the support of Permanent Forum or AMRIP? They're also there to advise and do research and provide those kind of technical advice that is needed, and even provide many examples of good practices that Pullman and Binota, for example, have mentioned. And AIPP as a regional organization is there to facilitate this kind of dialogue, to build that kind of partnership. But as we know, we are not in the position of authority and power. We cannot force the governments. We can only open our door for this kind of dialogue, where it is proactive and it is non-confrontational. But the state must also realize that by becoming overarchingly self-perpetuating and self-justifying instrument, they are also beginning to lose their defense of sovereignty, because sovereignty is based on some moral grounds, in which I may say is the social contract in some sense we are talking about. So without upholding and respecting the social contract, their defense of sovereignty becomes weak. They may try to show their power by becoming more authoritarian, but in the end, they're losing their defense of sovereignty. But if we transform that into that kind of the leadership that I just mentioned, then it leads towards conflict transformation and even social transformation. That is where their strength to defend their sovereignty becomes far more and more legitimate and acceptable. This is something that they have to realize. Therefore, we don't exist here to challenge the state or to pull down the state. That is not the point. We're here to dialogue. We're here to resource all experiences that is available and become more inclusive and transformative. So AIPP is here as a regional organization to do that. And at this point of time, AIPP, fortunately, we have a good consensus and also unity among the indigenous peoples. So the state should not fear about this disintegration and more conflict as we discuss these things. The fact is that indigenous peoples in Asia today is quite united, and they should take advantage of this, and we want to be open to this. But just very one important thing that I wanted to just strike is what Binota mentioned about Japan and so on, even Nepal. You see, these are two different things, but Philippines is a different example. Philippines is clearly, for example, an institutional design defect, why it is not working, even though they have such a good law. So we know that a good law is not enough. We also need to create other enabling conditions, and institutions needs to be properly designed. Institution needs to have cultural match for which it is designed for. These things are missing, for example. We're ready to step in this kind of things in a proactive way, not challenging. And also recognition means we are indigenous people, so we have to be recognized as indigenous peoples, not like in Nepal or like in Japan, where it is recognized as cultural autonomy and this kind of things. Because we are not here to perform dances for audiences and preserve that kind of a tradition that becomes archaic and has no relevance when we're talking about our well-being and as peoples. So that is, I think, a fundamental distinction we need. Starting points, I agree what Binota had also said about the CHT Accord or the Philippine law that is there. We can see what is wrong and how we can make it happen. We are ready to facilitate in those things. And AMRIP, Permanent Forum, Special Rapporteur, or any other UN mechanisms would definitely, I'm sure, respond positively if the state is ready. So the issue is readiness of the state. And readiness of the state seems to be affected by the fact that indigenous peoples are against development. Indigenous peoples will break up the territorial security, integrity of the states, and indigenous peoples are security threat to the nation and so on. No? I think these are just blown out of proportion without context and without facts. I think that needs to be analyzed so that our minds are open up and then we create the opening for this kind of engagement. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Gam, for emphasizing the role of the AIPP as a regional organizations to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples, and also pressurizing the each countries to ensure the indigenous people's right. And when we talk about the regional organizations, we forget the ASEAN or the SAARC as well, though these regional organizations which are formed inconsistent with the UN Charter. That means they follow the kind of principles of the United Nations as well. But though these are the mechanisms formed by the government themselves, and whether we can also pressurize to these government-formed regional mechanisms or not. So with this note, I would like to request Binota to continue. Maybe this may be a repetitive question for you as well. That, as I said, the regional organizations like SAARC and ASEAN, obviously, and what are the roles, these regional organizations, besides the, indigenous peoples formed or established organizations, how the government formed mechanisms also, or including the, now we are talking about indigenous specific UN mechanisms like MRIP or UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, especially to ensure the structure, the government structure as well as systems provide the inclusive outcomes for indigenous peoples, and how we can make the states accountable for the indigenous people's right. Binota?
Thank you, Deb. Once again, to me, how to make a state accountable, this is actually being in this position very crucial to response this point. But I agree with what Gam has just explained, the opportunities and barriers, and also to look into deeper from the state side, how best way really the inclusion and engagement can be enhanced. So here is the point now then. You mentioned this ASEAN and SAARC. We know ASEAN has a human rights body, and SAARC, the South Asian Cooperation, Regional Cooperation, they have not yet such body to look after the human rights issues or the rights of the peoples, whether saying their political interests on economic and other issues. But if we see also the ASEAN countries, while they form this ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, if you see the inclusion issue again come up, indigenous peoples, their rights, their expectations were excluded while it was preparing or it was adopting. And even until today, only a few commissioners of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights are positive for indigenous people's human rights, indigenous people's rights. And there are still challenges with other ASEAN states integrating indigenous people's issues in their agenda. So now what I'd like to say, the state are accountable or this and that. This is actually coming again. One is to what extent the rule of law is respected at the country level, to what extent the indigenous peoples are actually recognized at the national level, to what extent their effective participation in the decision-making process or inclusiveness in all the processes related to them are there. Gam has already mentioned one issue. This is really important, that's institutional defense. The capacities of the government is also related here. Now our challenge in the regions, what also I see, this is my personal view, not as an AMD member. So this is the challenge. Most of our Asian Asian states when it comes for this their capacity and also the integration and the inclusion of indigenous people issues. Yeah, so this is if you say then the accountable states accountable, then I will say it is really very critical to say from my point of view at this moment. But once only I could have said you that if there is the really rule of law, have the civic space, and you have a freedom of expression, if for the current context, if we see in the regions. So I like just to say here, in relation to this indigenous people's rights in the social contract, when we can make states accountable, this is only possible when it comes also the recognition towards the indigenous peoples because of their participation is matter there. Their voices matter. So when I say their voices matter is because this voice, the core, the voice is the core issue of bringing empowerment. If we don't have the such spirits through the recognition process, then we don't have the space also to say where the states are accountable to what level. And now we also see the other institutions type, like for example, say national human rights institutions, who talks about the human rights situation in general. But now again, if you see then to what extent is indigenous people's human rights are really addressed at the national level by the National Human Rights Commission. So this is also the matter. And they are also the body who also asks the question to the government's accountability on the human rights issues. They will be the one really officially mandated. So here also we see the gap. So here is the point now in terms of this accountability, the institutional role and our recognitions and our space in the, as Gam mentioned, as that architecture or this power structure. We don't have that space. So therefore, when it comes to the accountability, then from my point of view, it is actually far behind to say how we can ask the state for the accountability there, because we are even excluded from all the process, even the state building process, architecture until today. Also, let me give you some example now. If I say when 9 August 1993 declared by the UN General Assembly, the first UN decade, International Decade for Indigenous Peoples, taken what is that? Awareness raising, capacity building, this and that, all international level and also domestic level, it is done. But then when it comes for the partnership of action, or the second international decade, this Millennium Development Goals and these 6 areas of development, which is in line with the Permanent Forum mandate, what we achieve from the MDGs for the indigenous peoples. So if we can see the MDGs, but these Millennium Development Goals, our achievement actually on the ground is 0, practically. So now, whom should we ask for the accountability? Then this is the state responsibility supposed to do that, because they're the one committed to the UN General Assembly. And now, where they will, where will be their accountable then if they don't take this responsibility? They don't provide a space for the inclusion. They don't provide a space for the participation. They don't provide this legal and policy framework. So these are the challenges. So yeah, that's what I can share with you from my point of view about this states, ensuring states accountability. This is still far beyond from my perspective as indigenous peoples, because we are still excluded. We are not part of the state building process. We are not part of the structure. We are not part of the decision-making process. Of course, if we see our regional situation, our land, territories, resources, this is one of the core issues that everyday indigenous peoples are facing with gross and systematic human rights violations. So that's my opinion.
Thank you, Vinota. And as we have discussed long about the theme, the new social contract for building more inclusive state or state accountability as well. Now we are at the last stage of the program, and I would like to request Fulman Ji to conclude from your side with the wishes to the World Indigenous Peoples Day, as we are celebrating the International Day of the World Indigenous Peoples. So I would like to request you to give concluding remarks from your side and some wishes for the World Indigenous Peoples on this occasion.
Thank you once again, Devji, Vinotaji, Gamji, for your very wonderful contribution to this dialogue. Having this dialogue, let us commit to fully realizing the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the rights of self-determination and to traditional lands, territories, resources, and language. And wherever they live, let's ensure the indigenous peoples enjoy recognition for their contribution and opportunity to be strong and prosper in peace on healthy planet. I again take the opportunity on behalf of the UN Permanent Forum on Rights of Indigenous People to highlight the commitment to continue to engage with in partnership with indigenous peoples, member states, and other stakeholders to undertake strong steps in preserving, revitalizing, and promoting indigenous people rights and self-driven development, applying UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, ILO Convention 169, and other international human rights instruments at all levels. Congratulations once again, Devji, for the 6th anniversary of the Indigenous Television and also International Day of the World Indigenous People. Thank you, Devji. Over to you.
Thank you, Fulmanji, and also I would like to request Gam to give your concluding remarks with the wishes for the World Indigenous Brothers and Sisters on the occasion of International Day of World Indigenous Peoples. Gam?
Thank you, Dave. Because of time, very quickly. First thing is that if we are to move towards something when we're talking about the search for a new meaning and a new social contract, we need leaders who are committed to nation building and democracy building. I think that is first and foremost. And the minimum step that we can begin to take is to begin to understand how to make meaningful agreements. That is to say that the precondition for making any meaningful agreement is to accept that agreements have no meaning unless it is honored and implemented. That is the precondition for any kind of agreement making. Otherwise, we will keep seeing that governments are signing, adopting all these kinds of agreements in the UN or in the national level and so on, and nothing is done and no changes that we see. I think that is the beginning of one of the steps that can be taken and very crucial to move towards a more transformative pathways. And with that, I'll just end by saying that while expressing my solidarity to the indigenous brothers and sisters across the world, and also congratulating the Permanent Forum, AMRIP, Special Rapporteur, and many others that are working towards this. We are thankful to them for all the solidarity. I know that we're also talking about enhanced participation of indigenous peoples within the UN system and so on. So there are many people who are working in support of indigenous peoples as well. And I'm sure that this voice that gives some meaning, give meaning to our life, will ultimately prevail. So I would like to wish a very fruitful and meaningful observation of the Indigenous Peoples Day in Asia. And also congratulations to everyone. And also thanks to you, Dave, for making this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gam, and same for Binota, please, for your concluding remarks with the wishes.
Thank you, Deb. Once again, I'll take a little bit more time, maybe 3 minutes. What Gam and Fulman just said, I I see what Fulman said is important, and the call from the GAM, the partnership, cooperation, collaboration, and the good faith is very significant. And we should think about that for all levels. Now, from my point of view, which I didn't share in the beginning, the importance of the social contract, why I think this is very important at this moment, but we don't have much actually conversation. This political, philosophical way, but it is very important at this stage also for indigenous peoples to see. One is, given the historical perspective for indigenous peoples, these injustices we talk about, the impact of colonization, the policy of assimilation we see everywhere, and also the human rights of indigenous peoples, dispositions of the land, territories, resources, and also the opportunities of meaningfully establishing the relationship between the states and indigenous peoples, and the recognitions for their rights and freedom from determining, and also the from the discrimination and the wrongdoing things. And this is also to me an opportunity to see, as it is beginning, if we see that from the view of social contract, the opportunity is to enhancing harmonious and cooperative relations between the state and indigenous people as well. And the relationship, what I mean, is based on the principle of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination, and good faith. And now also the other issue, like to recognize the urgent needs of indigenous people at this stage, at this moment. Even though we had more than 20, we had a 20 years of international decade. 20 years international decade for the indigenous peoples, but there is still need the urgent to respect and promote our inherent rights as indigenous peoples, which derive from our political, economic, and social structures, and our cultures, these spiritual traditions, our histories and philosophies, and our right to the land, territories, and resources, these all are connected, and there is still a need, very urgent issue for us to address. And that's why the social contract, from my point of view, is very important, and need to see how we can turn this political discussion among the indigenous peoples, and also create the space between the states and indigenous peoples. Now, for the International Days of the World's Indigenous Peoples, my message, well, to me, I like to say, make this day meaningful as the recognition of our identity at the international level. We should remember that this 9 August, it started formally when indigenous peoples laid their footsteps through the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples in 1982 on 9 August. And this is remarkable day for indigenous peoples. So worldwide, so this is, we need to take the opportunity also at the national level. And we also have to see, because this beginning, the journey started 9 August 1982. This has expanded so much, like by creating UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, and most importantly, the significant achievement of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In more than 20 years negotiation between state and indigenous peoples, there's the Working Group Indigenous Populations, the venue created such opportunity, and the start is 9 August 1982. So we should remember this day, we should really make it very meaningful. And this International Day is also the occasion to educate the public on issues of the concern, our indigenous people issues, to create a positive political development environment to mobilize political will, and also the resources to address our issues, our aspirations, and reinforcement for achievements of humanity in general. So anyway, I will conclude by acknowledging to all the sacrifices made by our indigenous peoples leaders and activists for the cause of these rights, for our rights, and pay my respect to the elders of the past and present. Happy International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, and I also wish all the best of indigenous television in Nepal. Long live indigenous media. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinata. The Indigenous Television and the ITV Nepal recently launched satellite television actually had conducted this special program on the occasion of International Day of World Indigenous Peoples. So on behalf of Indigenous Television and the ITV Nepal, I would like to thank you all three distinguished panelists. Shimray, Secretary General of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, Vice Chair of Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Vinota Moedomai, and member of UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Fulman Chaudhary, for managing your time despite your busy schedule and for sharing your amazing thoughts on this year's theme, the Leaving No One Behind Indigenous Peoples and the call for a new social contract, and the theme of this year's International Day of World Indigenous Peoples. And thank you. Keep watching Indigenous Television and ITV Nepal, and I would like to wish and say happy International Day of World Indigenous Peoples to all of you. Thank you. Namaste.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinota, Gandhi.
Thank you.